Hello out there, it's Michael from Fujifilm. Before I tell you what we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you a question to ponder. When people take pictures of themselves with their cell phones, why is it they use selfie sticks instead of just holding it right there? So we're not going to talk about any products in this episode except for the MKX cinema zooms, and that is going to be because of a particular characteristic they have called Parfocal. No, what we're going to talk about today is math. That's right. Proportions, trigonometry, geometry. So as I'm recording this, it's late August. School has gone back to session in some places. Kids are leaving for college. They're going back to learn new things. So I started thinking about math. Well, in particular, we're going to talk about how math determines what we call perspective. And there is a misconception among many people that perspective is caused by focal length. And that's not right. I'm going to illustrate for you exactly what perspective is all about. All right, so here's my selfie stick. I've been using this thing for decades. It's been basically bulletproof. It's got a nice tough ball head on the end, and here I have my X-T3 with a 16-50 lens, and this does the job really, really well. It's fantastic. So, if you've thought about that question I posed to you, why don't people want to hold their phone right here? Why do they want to get it farther away? And the answer is perspective. They want a better perspective. So this distance I measured from my nose to my hand is exactly 24 inches. Now, think about any time you've had a portrait taken, especially by a professional, say for a corporate headshot, or if you're an actor or something like that. Where does the photographer stand? Does the photographer stand 24 inches away? No. They stand 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 feet away, and then they use a focal length that basically places the head height at a certain, well-established range in the frame. The focal lengths that people tend to use, depending on which sensor format or film you're using, could be like 50 or 56 millimeters, 80, 85 millimeters, 110 millimeters. Again, that depends on sensor size and film. And that has been established by decades and decades and decades of practice, that those focal lengths happen to work at that particular distance. In the interest of science, to illustrate my point, I'm allowing myself to be photographed in a very unflattering way. So what I did here was I took our XF 16 to 55 2.8 lens. I put it at 16 millimeter and put it very, very close to myself, and I went to 55 millimeters, and I moved the camera back and forth until I got very close to the same head height. And if you compare the things, well, one of them is much more flattering than the other. Nobody wants to have that first set of shots where the camera is at 16 millimeter. And you go, aha, yeah, it's that wide angle distortion. It's because it's the lens. And the answer is no, it's not because of the lens. It's because the camera is so close to my face to get that particular head height. It's about the mathematics. So the distance between your nose, say, to the back of your ear is about 4 inches or something like that. Well, if the camera is only, say, 10 inches away with a wide-angle lens, then if you do the math, the proportions between where the camera is to, say, your nose and where the camera is to, say, the back of your ear, those proportions are significantly large. But if I move the camera back, like I said, 4 or 5 feet, that changes the ratios completely. That right there is what determines perspective. It's where you stand. Think about it in terms of our language. If you're having a philosophical or a political discussion with somebody, okay, you might ask them, where do you stand on this topic? You literally use the word, where do you stand? What's your stance on this topic? Our eyes have a fixed focal length. We cannot zoom in or out with our eyes like you can by choosing different lenses. So basically anything that renders the world, your picture, in a way that's different than our focal length is in effect a kind of distortion. And I'm not talking about optical distortion like pincushion or a barrel or that kind of thing. I'm talking about spatial distortion. So to demonstrate what I'm talking about is I've shot some more headshots of myself, and I did it inside, put the camera in a long hallway, got it far away, and I did it at 300 millimeters and at 500 millimeters. And if you look here, you see what happens to my face and my head is it becomes much flatter and it seems much rounder. It's starting to look like a basketball, I have to admit. This is the opposite of having that camera too close. What is happening here is what's called the telephoto compression effect. It's not really compression, it's just that everything is rendered more or less the same size because the camera is so much farther away from all the subjects. In filmmaking, because people are moving and the camera is moving, and we have the ability to zoom our lenses during the shot. A lot of starting filmmakers will make the mistake of thinking that a zoom is the same as moving the camera, and it's not. Because I want you to understand that perspective has to do with where the camera is positioned relative to the foreground and your main subject. Okay, so it's where the camera is located, not the focal length you're using. So let's go to some cinema examples. So I set the camera up with an MKX 50-135, which is the longer version of this lens. And I use the 50 millimeter as the starting point. And I set up the framing here so I have some foreground objects, some middle ground objects, and some farther distant objects. Okay, so the first thing I did was I left the lens at 50 millimeters and I dollied. I pushed the camera in closer and closer while manually adjusting the focus to keep the model sharp. Okay, so I moved the camera forward, I moved the camera backward, and I changed the focus based on the marks that I set on the side of the lens to keep things as sharp as possible, doing it all by hand. The second thing then, I left the camera at the farthest back position, and with the focus locked on the model, I zoomed back and forth, and I zoomed into, again, where I could get the head height to match the closest spot at the 50 millimeter focal length. And you can see there's dramatic differences. I could have corrected the tilt of the camera, but I chose not to, because what we're looking at here is the difference in the angles as we approach the model closer and closer. We start to look up at her more. She becomes higher relative to the camera very, very quickly. Whereas when when I'm in the back and just zooming in, her height is not actually changing in the frame. I'm just making a narrower angle of view. In the dollying in, you actually literally get that sense of movement, okay? But with zooming, you can see this definitely has a different feel, because all we're doing is cropping out those foreground elements. We're just cropping them out. We're not moving past them. We're just cropping them out. And a longer focal length only changes your angle of view. It does not change your perspective. However, there is something that you do notice and you do have to pay attention with focal length, is that the depth of field will change, okay? And you notice as I zoom from the 50 to about 100 millimeters on that lens, if you look at the trees in the far background, they go more out of focus as I zoom in than when I'm simply dollying in. And that is because of the change of focal length, and the change of focal length causes a change in depth of field. So what I wanted to point out now about this Parfocal is the reason I use the MKX is that a Parfocal lens will maintain focus when you zoom it back and forth. And that's why I wanted to use this. Now, those of you with autofocus lenses think you have Parfocal lenses, but they're not. It's just the camera is refocusing for you as you move forward and backward. The camera keeps things in focus. So you think all zoom lenses are Parfocal, but that's not true. If you switch into manual focus mode, you're going to see that the focus is going to go in and out quite dramatically with almost any autofocus still camera lens. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you. I'll see you soon.